We don't have that.
So my name is Jason Chretien. My last name is usually difficult to remember, but if you think of the Grecian formula and just change the Grecian to the Grecian, you'll remember it like that.
Nice.
So while I am relatively new to this club, I've been in previous clubs in St. Louis and in New Orleans. I've been growing plants for the better part of 30-ish years now. I tend to, and I'll kind of share why this is maybe important to start with a little bit about how I grow, because it's going to be a story of compare and contrast with the earlier presentation. So primarily grow adenium and pachypodium. Those are my two jams. What I found is that I ran out of species with both those genuses, so I had to go to Euphorbia because there are how many different species? 2,000 plus. So I went down a rabbit hole with Euphorbia, and I've continued to go down the same rabbit hole with Euphorbia into getting into very difficult to grow and very difficult to find species. And I think you picked up on that when you walked by. This Euphorbia is a lot like many Euphorbias in terms of the flowers that it generates, the growth form, its shape, and we're going to cover a lot of that today. But I'm also going to share with you kind of how I grow. So I'm kind of the polar opposite of Robert in that I grow nothing indoors. Everything is outdoors. I have no greenhouse. So everything is kind of as it, where I kind of put it in my mind is like try to replicate a little bit of what it looks like in its habitat, recognizing that I can't mirror its habitat. So I try to learn from what I can from it growing in habitat, and then kind of bring it back to my area, my conditions, and then adapt it for how I grow. So you often hear of things being grown hard. Is that a kind of a familiar term that everybody's kind of heard? So keeping things under potted, not potting up very often, but trying to generate its truest form. So what I'm going to start with is kind of how I grow this plant. We're going to dive a little bit into kind of where it's from, because that gives you some indication of what it likes. And then I'm going to show some images that I found online that represent what this plant looks like when it gets to a mature form. Is then it's, that for me is like, okay, how am I doing? How is my plant doing? Is it, because it's growing weird now? Is it gone, are the leaves oddly shaped? Or am I doing something that may not be as beneficial as it could be for growing this plant? So here we go. So the growth form is geophylitic, and that is basically it has a tuberous root underground which stores water. I mean, I think we've all kind of heard that. The caudix is a familiar trait to this plant, and oftentimes the caudix is raised up like many Euphorbia, adenium, and pachypodium, so you can see the caudix. The leaves and the flowering, this, while is, in a habitat, so kind of southern hemisphere, the plant itself is endemic to Madagascar, and these grow instructions are for southern hemisphere, so you'll kind of notice how I flip kind of later in the presentation, because a lot of the stylistic pieces for growing this plant are based in kind of those who have grown them in a southern hemisphere. But for me, this plant is a summer grower. Like many other plants, once it adapts to a northern hemisphere, it'll pick up on our heat and temperature cycles and will go dormant by dropping its leaves in the winter, pushing them back out in the spring. One of the interesting things and how you can really begin to tell this plant, and I hope everybody kind of gets a chance to come up and kind of look at it, there are these little bristly type appendages at the end of every branch, and that's one of the unique characteristics of this plant. Is it could, some could say, well, it looks a little bit like an adenium. It kind of does, but not 100%. But those the dense red bristles are partly how it's gotten its name, but also how it grows. And then it produces small, kind of, atypical kind of, Euphorbia flower. And I think I had it on one of the first images. So as I mentioned, It's native to the red Tsingy area in Madagascar, which is basically northern Madagascar, and we're going to dive a little bit deeper into that in a second. But it's in limestone, which is also something just to kind of remember as we're thinking about what this looks like. It thrives in dry tropical biomes, so those places that go from hot to cool, not cold, but hot to cool, relatively quickly at various times throughout the year. And then, of course, the water is stored within its paddocks. So as I mentioned, kind of map of Madagascar, if you will. So the region we're talking about is way up here, which is different than most of Madagascar in terms of how it receives its water, what its temperatures are, how the winds affect the plant. And it becomes important for me to kind of think about how the particular plant is grown. So that is the red Tsingy, if you've never seen it before. So, and it's really unique in that it's this, this laterite is a unique type of soil. And it looks to be a beautiful region. I've never been to Madagascar. That's the place that I need to go to. I mean, it's been calling my name for a number of years. You're really?
2 years, everybody, we're gonna do it.
Oh yeah, oh yeah.
Well, 2
Count
years to
count
start
me
saving
in.
money. I'm serious.
And this is, it's not just limestone, it's this red laterite that this particular plant is known to grow in. The Megalese people, which are the native people to Madagascar, had used a lot of this type of soil for like face painting. They also use it to make bricks, which I thought was kind of interesting because of the way it compacts down. Again, just kind of something to keep in mind as you think about, hey, what do I grow this plant in? Rusty red color, and there's a couple of views of that. So Sabrina, the next one. So this is just a climate map. And remember, we're up in this clear blue region up north. And I think the thing that I found most interesting is this temperature variation. Notice that it's 69 to 89. So it's consistently warm. It doesn't go cold. So I kind of use that as a bit of an earmark. Rarely temperatures below 67. And I think most of us know kind of rule of thumb, most succulents, U50 is the kind of the bottom, if you will, of temperature. Anything below 50, and kind of the rule of thumb I use is if wet and under 50 equals dead. So I try to stay away from that. And then total rainfall in that particular region between, 1/10 of an inch and 8 inches. So not a tremendous amount of rain. I love this thing because this is kind of what tells the story for me. When does the rain come, and then how often, whether it's muggy, warm, or hot, and then what the pool beach score is, which is kind of comfort level, if you will. But notice how it rains when it's hot, doesn't rain when it's cool. So what that tells me is a little bit about what the plant likes. What do I do? How does that fit then into my regimen? So I use these kind of, and there's a website that this comes from, and I could look it up, but I use this again as an indicator. So Sabrina, the next one. So thinking about cultivation and care, only watering when it's an active growth. So the rule of thumb I use is if there are no leaves, there is no water. And I'll hold it off. And I do that with a lot of my plants. And again, it's the way I grow, not the way that everybody grows, but it's the way I've found and I've been the most successful. Well-draining soil is kind of an absolute. I don't use as many types of things in my soil, but I do use pumice and coir. I mean, those are the two basics to my soil. Light, full sun to light shade does not like low light. So I move my plants around to kind of feel what they like or don't like in terms of light. Temperature we touched on pretty much year round. Fertilization, I tend to use a higher potassium than a 20-20-20. It's usually, 10, 28 or something like that. I'd have to go back and look at Can only be propagated for seed, so I need another plant, and I don't have another plant. I was fortunate to get this one, which started out as, you know, most seedlings do, you know, nothing and not very descriptive. And the biggest issue with this plant is wet roots. It will not survive wet roots. Hence, you think, you know, watering, and I use much the technique that Robert had talked about earlier, is I lift my plants. And I know just by weight, kind of how much water is in the pot. If I think it needs more water, it doesn't get water. I go more on that side. I'd rather withhold water than over water. And, you know, as Robert said, I'm always touching my plants. I know what they should look like. And you can tell if something's going sideways, usually through, you know, that kind of an observation. So these are a couple of images of mature plants, not plants that I own, but what the growth form for this plant looks like. So this plant I've had for 5 years now, but the plant is about 8 years old. And again, I keep my plants underpotted and small. This is one of hundreds. So, you know, as you grow and you collect plants, space becomes an issue. So I tried to, rather than grow everything to its largest form, I try for its most compact, natural form. But you'll notice, here are some of those, the red fibers that I was talking about at the end of the branch, and you kind of can see them on basically every branch tip. And then 3. And this is mine as it was just starting to leaf out in the spring, and you can kind of see the red Euphorbia type flowers. And those are the kind of the red portions of my plant, kind of a little bit closer up. Oh, I would be remiss if I didn't say, be careful with Euphorbia, with your cutting and all that stuff. I have never followed that rule. I'm probably going to pay the price at some point, but I cut, break everything I do with my adeniums. I don't use gloves and I don't wear glasses, but I mean, that's just the way I do it.
So where did you get it?
That's what I want to know.
There was a grower, some of you may know her. She's Paradise Found out of southern Florida. She's not doing her gig anymore. She's gone a little off the reservation as of late. But she was doing a consignment, and I've known Kate for a number of years and purchased a number of plants for her. And she had a grower who had passed and was trying to sell his collection. And she would do these consignment sales. And I was just fortunate enough to get in on that consignment sale. But it's an impossible plant to find. So it's always a little bit trickier because these are the tough ones. It's like, you know, you've maybe got a once in a lifetime shot at a plant, and you just don't see them anymore. And it's not because I think they're impossible to grow. I just don't think many have the growth stock to grow them.
Thank you.